June 15th sat heavy on Harlem like a lid that wouldn't lift. The kind of night where heat stayed trapped between brick walls, where the air felt thick enough to slow footsteps, where the streetlights painted the pavement in weak yellow patches that never quite reached the corners. East 132nd Street looked ordinary if someone didn't know what to look for. Storefronts closed, windows dim, radios low. A city pretending it was asleep while the truth moved through shadows. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had walked that stretch so many times it had become part of him. Not because he was careless, but because routine is what men lean on when they've built rules around chaos. For months, the same late-night rhythm repeated out the back of a club, down the familiar sidewalk, toward the waiting car. The distance was short, the time was predictable. And in New York, predictability is often the first thing a hungry enemy studies. The first shot didn't sound like a single gunshot. It sounded like a door slamming inside the world. The second and third arrived so fast they blurred into the first. Then the night became continuous thunder. Not a few cracks, not a warning. A full, sustained eruption that rolled down the block as if the city had decided to punish one man with the loudest sentence it could pronounce. 42 rounds in seconds. People would later say they could count them, but counting was impossible in the moment. The sound wasn't separate shots anymore. It was one long roar that drowned out thought and turned instinct into the only language left. Doors snapped shut. Bodies dropped low. Curtains jerked closed. A mother pulled her child off a bed and into the floor without even knowing why, only knowing that the sound of that much gunfire meant someone important had just been chosen. Bumpy took hits that should have ended him. The impact turned his body against itself, twisting him, stealing balance, forcing him downward. He fell hard onto pavement that offered no mercy. Under the thin streetlight, the wet spread quickly beneath him, reflecting yellow in a way that looked almost black. The block stayed silent, not because it didn't care, but because in Harlem, survival has rules too. You don't scream when violence is still deciding if it's finished. Then it stopped. The roar cut off so suddenly the silence felt loud. The kind of silence that follows a disaster when everyone is waiting to hear if there will be more. For a moment, East 132nd Street didn't move. It held its breath. It waited for the final sound that usually comes after an execution, footsteps running, a car door slamming, someone shouting victory. Instead, there was only distance. The men who fired those rounds left the way professionals leave. Not panicked, not rushing, no dramatic confirmation. They had been paid to believe the outcome was guaranteed. They slid out of the neighborhood the way smoke slides out of a cracked window, quiet, quick, and gone before the street could fully understand what it had witnessed. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a name. He was structure. He was order in a place the city preferred disorganized. Whether people loved him, feared him, or simply relied on the stability around him, they understood the same truth. Removing him wouldn't just remove a man. It would loosen the entire neighborhood. And then, something happened that no one expected. The shape on the pavement moved. Not standing, not rising. Just a twitch of fingers against wet concrete. A shallow lift of the chest. A stubborn sign of breath. A tiny refusal to become a body. That refusal changed the meaning of everything. Because now it wasn't only an execution attempt. It was a failure. And failed executions create consequences that succeed far beyond bullets. 30 seconds later, tires screamed around the corner, like the street was being pulled open. A car stopped too fast, smoke rising from rubber, and Marcus Webb, one of the few men close enough to Bumpy to move without asking permission, threw himself out into the night. He didn't slow down to look for danger. He ran straight to the collapsed figure in the street, dropping to his knees in the wet as if the pavement didn't matter. He saw the truth up close, and it nearly broke him. Not just the blood, not just the damage, the impossible fact that the man still hadn't left the world. Behind them, East Street sealed itself back up. Curtains remained closed, doors stayed shut. Harlem's oldest survival code activated again. If strangers ask, you heard nothing worth repeating. In the back seat, Bumpy's breath came shallow and wet, each inhale like it cost something precious. Marcus gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles burned, because he understood the terrifying math of what was happening. If Bumpy survived, The city's balance would change. If he died, Harlem would become a battlefield. And somewhere between those two outcomes, a secret was forming, one that would decide what the next 24 hours looked like for everyone who thought 42 shots could solve a 20-year problem. By sunrise, the men who ordered the hit would still believe Harlem's king was gone, but in a hidden room far from East Street, Bumpy Johnson would open his eyes and set in motion the real beginning of the war they thought they'd already won. Harlem kept its own time after the shooting. On East 132nd Street, the block had already returned to its oldest habit, silence that protects. Storefronts stayed shuttered. Curtains didn't move. Radios played low enough to pretend the night had been nothing but distant thunder. In a city trained to punish witnesses, people learned long ago that survival sometimes meant acting like you heard nothing at all. But the truth was already traveling, just not in a way the police could trace. It moved through the same hidden channels Harlem always used when official systems felt dangerous. It moved through men who owed favors, women who carried warnings without using names, and drivers who took routes that avoided attention. The message was simple, terrifying, and almost impossible to believe. Bumpy Johnson had been hit, and Bumpy Johnson might still be breathing. That possibility hit Harlem harder than the gunfire had. If he was dead, the neighborhood would grieve, adjust, and brace for outsiders to rush in. If he was alive, the neighborhood would become something else entirely: alert, defensive, and ready to close around him like a fist. The shooters had been careful. They didn't linger. They didn't celebrate. They left without checking. That meant they trusted the math. It meant they believed the contract was completed. And if they believed that, the people who paid them would already be planning the next morning as if Harlem's crown had fallen into the street. So, Marcus made the most dangerous decision a man can make in New York. He refused to go to a hospital. A hospital meant records. Records meant reports. Reports meant attention. Attention meant the people who ordered the hit would hear the only news they feared: survival, and send someone back to erase it properly. The city's official systems were not built to protect men like Bumpy Johnson. They were built to document them, cage them, and sometimes deliver them. So Marcus took him somewhere else. A small clinic in the Bronx that existed for one reason: to keep certain people alive without creating a paper trail that would get them killed afterward. The building didn't look like anything special. That was the point. Places like that survive by being overlooked. They live in the gap. That loyalty became urgent now, because if Bumpy lived, Harlem had a chance to stay intact. If he died, the neighborhood would be carved open by hungry hands before the funeral flowers even wilted. Hours passed in a blur of controlled panic. The building's clock kept moving like it didn't understand the stakes. The night shifted toward morning. The city outside kept breathing, unaware of the invisible battle happening in a small room where survival was being negotiated inch by inch. By the time dawn began to pale the edges of the sky, Robinson's hands finally slowed, not because the danger was gone, but because the immediate collapse had been postponed. The bleeding was controlled enough to hold. The breathing was stable enough to continue. The body, impossibly, had not quit. But the victory was fragile. Survival after trauma like that was not a finish line. It was an opening, the kind that invites new danger. Because the people who ordered the hit would not accept uncertainty for long. They would want confirmation. If they didn't get it, they would send someone to find it. That meant every hour after sunrise was a countdown. Bumpy's eyes opened with the same kind of focus that made people fear him even before he had power. Not wide, not confused. Focused. A man returning to the world not with relief, but with calculation. He couldn't stand. He couldn't walk. He couldn't even speak without cost. But his mind was intact. And an intact mind, inside a man who just survived an execution attempt, is more dangerous than a healthy body. The clinic room filled with a new kind of silence, one that wasn't panic anymore. It was anticipation, because everyone understood what survival would demand next. Not revenge as pride, not violence as emotion, something colder, à correction. Bumpy had been removed from the street, but the people who ordered the hit would soon move to remove his structure. They would test loyalty, pressure his people, move into territory that had been protected by a 20-year understanding. If Harlem hesitated, it would be eaten alive, and Bumpy Johnson, pinned to a bed with a body that should have been dead, understood he didn't need to move to respond. He needed only two things: time and secrecy, because if the city learned he was alive too soon, the second wave would come, and the second wave would not leave until it saw proof. Before the day ended, Bumpy's survival would become a weapon, but only if Harlem could keep one impossible secret long enough for him to strike, where the men who ordered the hit never expected. The most dangerous part of surviving an execution is not the bleeding. It is the quiet that follows. As the sun climbed over New York, the city did what it always did after violence. It assumed the story was finished. 42 shots, 12 hits, no body found by police, no ambulance report, no hospital record. In a city trained to believe paperwork equals truth, the absence of documents became confirmation. The assumption spread fast and comfortable. He was gone. That assumption was exactly what Harlem needed, and exactly what would destroy the men who made it. He asked for nothing dramatic, no speeches, no calls to rally soldiers, no orders shouted into the room. He asked for information. That request changed the temperature of the room, because information meant intention, and intention meant the response would not be emotional. It would be exact. Marcus Webb understood immediately. He didn't argue. He didn't question whether it was too soon. He knew Bumpy's rule better than anyone. Survival only matters if it is used correctly. Wasted survival invites a second attempt. So Marcus did what Harlem had always done best. He activated the network quietly. Phones rang that were never written down. Messages traveled through people who understood how to carry news without carrying names. The question moved faster than the police ever could. Who paid? Who planned? Who broke the agreement? The answers arrived in fragments, not confirmations. Patterns, out-of-town shooters, money traced through familiar channels, names connected to a new generation that believed patience was weakness. Those fragments were enough. Bumpy listened without reacting. That restraint frightened the men around him more than anger ever could. Anger burns fast. Calculation lasts. Every detail was placed in order, not because he enjoyed control, but because control was the only language the city respected when violence failed. Outside the clinic, Harlem began to feel the shift. Not relief, not panic, expectation. The neighborhood sensed something unfinished hovering in the air. The usual predators didn't move with confidence. They tested corners and retreated. Men who thought Harlem would crack without its anchor waited for chaos that didn't come. That waiting turned into uncertainty, and uncertainty is expensive. Meanwhile, the men who ordered the hit were celebrating quietly, not loudly, not recklessly. They believed the contract had worked. Their confidence rested on the same assumption the city had made, that nobody survives that many bullets. That assumption let them relax just enough to make mistakes. Meetings resumed. Conversations loosened. A few early moves were made toward territory that had always been off limits. Harlem noticed those moves immediately. Not as invasion, as proof that the night on East 132nd Street had not been random, proof that someone believed the structure was gone, proof that silence was being misread as surrender. Bumpy absorbed that proof from a bed he could barely move in. He understood the mathematics better than anyone. If the city learned he was alive too soon, the response would be panic. Panic would bring another wave of violence. Violence would bring law enforcement attention that couldn't be controlled. And attention would collapse everything he had built to keep Harlem insulated. So he chose the hardest option. He stayed dead. For 6 hours, nothing leaked. No whispers of survival. No rumors of a clinic. No sign that the execution had failed. Those 6 hours did more damage than any bullet ever could. Because in those hours, the men who ordered the hit committed themselves. They acted on belief. They made decisions that could not be undone once the truth surfaced. They showed their hand completely, assuming the table was theirs. Bumpy didn't rush the moment. He waited until the city leaned forward. Then he moved, not with gunfire, but with alignment. Messages went out with precision. Not many, just enough. To people who needed to know one thing only: the assumption was wrong. The man they believed erased was breathing, and the correction would be handled quietly, cleanly, and without mercy for mistakes. Those messages did not travel far. They didn't need to. They landed exactly where they were supposed to land. The emotional weight of that realization hit hard and uneven. Men who had laughed the night before stopped laughing. Phones were checked too often. Meetings were postponed without explanation. Confidence collapsed into calculation. And calculation led to fear. Fear did not spread through Harlem. It spread outward. Bumpy knew the moment had arrived when the city's posture changed again. Not defensive, focused. People didn't ask questions anymore. They didn't speculate. They prepared for closure, not chaos. That distinction mattered. He did not need an army. He needed synchronization, the kind that happens when everyone understands the same rule without being told. When agreements are broken at this level, the response cannot be partial. Partial responses invite repeats. The clinic room filled with quiet movement. Paper appeared. Routes were sketched. Timelines narrowed. The plan was not loud or dramatic. It was deliberate. It acknowledged the truth of the situation without exaggeration. The men who ordered the hit believed removing one body would unlock Harlem. What they failed to understand was that Harlem was not a body. It was a system, and systems don't bleed out. They recalibrate. By the time the 6th hour ended, the city's worst assumption had fully matured. The men responsible believed they had won. Harlem believed something else entirely. And Bumpy Johnson, still confined to a bed, had already moved further than anyone on the street. Because the most dangerous responses are not immediate. They are timed. When the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't come as a warning. It would arrive as a finished decision. And the men who ordered the hit would realize the 6 hours of silence had sealed their fate. Power does not collapse loudly. It recalculates. That was the mistake the men who ordered the hit never understood. They believed power lived in noise, in bullets, in bodies, in fear that traveled fast and left people scrambling. They believed removing one man would create a vacuum they could rush into before anyone realized what was missing. But Harlem was not missing anything. It comes from instruction. Inside Harlem's invisible machinery, alignment had occurred. People who didn't normally sit in the same rooms understood the same truth at once. This situation would not end halfway. If it did, the city would bleed for years. Partial responses invite repetition. Complete ones prevent it. Bumpy Johnson remained out of sight, and that invisibility became part of the pressure. The men who ordered the hit didn't know where he was, didn't know how badly he was hurt, and most importantly, didn't know how much he already knew. That uncertainty ate into confidence faster than threats ever could. Phones rang and went unanswered. Messages were sent and never acknowledged. Meetings lost attendance without explanation. These were not coincidences. They were signals. Signals that said protection was thinning, that old assurances no longer applied, that the cost of association was rising rapidly. The emotional temperature of the city shifted again. Harlem wasn't angry. It was resolved. And resolution is dangerous because it doesn't argue with itself. It doesn't need validation. It's simply, and now, they were being used. By midnight, the city's power brokers understood something serious was underway. Not revenge, correction. The kind that doesn't seek attention but reshapes behavior permanently. Correction that teaches lessons without repeating them. The men who ordered the hit began to realize they were isolated. Not cornered. Isolated. Isolation is worse because it leaves you room to think about what's coming. Bumpy's survival was no longer the secret that mattered. His timing was. The longer he stayed unseen, the more committed his enemies became to the belief that the job was done. And the deeper that belief sank, the harder the correction would land. That was intentional. Harlem waited, not for chaos, for confirmation. Confirmation that the city would choose stability over pride, structure over spectacle, finality over endless cycles of violence. That confirmation arrived quietly, the way most important decisions do. People stopped speculating. They started preparing for the aftermath. Not funerals, adjustments. Because whatever happened next would redraw lines that had stood for decades. Lines that had been respected not because they were fair, but because crossing them cost too much. The men responsible for the shooting had crossed one anyway, and now the cost was being calculated with cold precision. Bumpy's body lay broken in a hidden room, but his influence moved freely. That was the part no one had planned for. You can plan for gunmen. You can plan for retaliation. You cannot plan easily for a man who survives long enough to let his enemies expose themselves completely. By the end of the night, New York felt it. Not in sirens, not in headlines, in hesitation, in restraint, in the sudden understanding that something had been decided without being announced. The city didn't know what form the correction would take. It didn't need to. It only needed to recognize that the rules had been reaffirmed and that the men who broke them were no longer protected by time, distance, or silence. Bumpy Johnson had taken 12 bullets and lived. Now the city was about to learn that survival was never the end of the story. It was the opening move. Before the next sunrise, the response would finally surface not as chaos, but as a pattern so clear that everyone in New York would understand what those 42 shots had truly started. Morning didn't arrive with clarity. It arrived with consequence. New York woke up believing the night before had ended something. 42 shots had echoed. 12 had found flesh. The city assumed that was how these stories closed. A man falls. The space he occupied opens. Someone else steps in. Order resumes under a different name. That assumption lasted exactly as long as it took for the city to notice what wasn't happening. Harlem didn't fracture. It didn't erupt. It didn't invite outsiders to test its edges. It held. That stillness was the first signal that something had gone wrong for the men who ordered the hit. They expected noise. They expected confusion. They expected movement they could exploit. Instead, they found resistance without resistance, streets that didn't cooperate, people who didn't answer, routines that no longer aligned with their expectations. Power was not pushing back. It was withholding. Inside the hidden clinic, Bumpy Johnson lay motionless, except for the effort of breathing. Pain lived everywhere. Bones protested. Organs demanded attention. Every system in his body worked harder than it should have, but pain was familiar. What mattered now was memory, and memory was intact. Those shifts never make headlines, but they end wars before they start. By afternoon, the assumption of victory had turned into confusion. By evening, confusion became concern. The men responsible felt the city looking through them instead of at them. That sensation, being seen without being acknowledged, is what finally broke their certainty. Because certainty depends on recognition. Bumpy remained unseen on purpose. His silence wasn't weakness, it was pressure. It forced others to fill the vacuum with their own actions, their own miscalculations. They moved too soon. They revealed priorities. They showed exactly how they planned to divide Harlem once the dust settled. That plan was now evidence. Harlem absorbed it quietly and adjusted. Not with threats, with refusal, the kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't need explanation. The kind that says, "Not here, not like this, not anymore." That refusal became the city's answer. When the truth finally surfaced that the execution had failed, that the man they believed erased was still breathing, it did not shock New York. It clarified it. Everything that had felt strange suddenly made sense. The silence, the hesitation, the closed doors. Survival had recalibrated power. Bumpy didn't need to appear publicly to complete the lesson. His survival was already doing the work. It told everyone watching the same thing. Violence had been attempted at the highest level and had failed. And when violence fails, the response cannot be emotional. It must be final. The city understood what that meant. Not blood in the streets, but lines redrawn so clearly that crossing them again would feel unthinkable. The men who ordered the hit faced a choice they hadn't planned for. Push forward and ignite a conflict that would consume profit, loyalty, and time. Or retreat and accept a quieter loss, the kind that doesn't end careers immediately but ensures they never feel safe again. They chose retreat, not because they were merciful, because they were rational. Rational men know when the cost outweighs the reward. They know when a structure has proven it can absorb violence and remain intact. They know when a lesson has been delivered without needing repetition. Harlem felt the shift in its bones. Not celebration. Relief. The deep kind that settles after a storm passes without destroying the house. People returned to routines with new awareness. The neighborhood didn't grow louder. It grew steadier. Bumpy Johnson recovered slowly. Pain stayed with him. It would stay for the rest of his life. But pain had never been the measure of power. Control was. And control had been reaffirmed in the most dangerous way possible by surviving the impossible and refusing to waste it. Years later, people would still talk about the night 42 shots tried to end a man and failed. They would debate angles, luck, timing. They would focus on the violence, because violence is easier to understand than restraint. But those who knew better remembered something else. They remembered what didn't happen. No collapse. No invasion. No VAR. They remembered the rule that survived the bullets. That Harlem could not be taken by force without paying a price too high to justify the attempt. That agreements existed not because they were fair, but because breaking them invited consequences that lasted longer than any victory. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive to prove he was untouchable. He survived to prove something far more dangerous. That power isn't the ability to pull a trigger. It's the ability to decide what happens after the trigger is pulled and still be standing when the city recalculates around you. 12 bullets hit Bumpy Johnson, but what survived that night wasn't just a man. It was the rule that no one in New York ever dared to break again.